So let's dive into the respiratory system. What we're going to start off with is the upper respiratory tract. So this is a median cut of the head. So the first structures we come across is the external nares. You've heard them called nostrils, but for the purposes of this class, they're the external nares. Think of them as the opening to the nasal cavity. This area is also called the vestibule, the nasal vestibule. Then we get to this area, which is the nasal cavity. Within the nasal cavity, you need to know about the concha and the meatus. So the concha are going to be these protrusions, and the meatus is going to be these areas in between them. So we have our superior concha, middle concha, inferior meatus, middle meatus, and superior meatus. Going back, we now come across the internal nares, and think of that as sort of the opening to the nasopharynx region. We have our auditory tube right here, and now we are traveling down behind the oral cavity. So this is the hard palate right here. This is the soft palate and the uvula right there. And then if we keep going down, you need to know about these structures that make up the larynx. So you have your epiglottis. This is what will close when you swallow, so food will travel down the esophagus. And then you have your glottis, which is composed of the vocal cords. You have both a false and a true vocal cord. And then you have the trachea. You also need to know the parts of the pharynx. Think of these as regions. So we have our nasopharynx behind the nasal cavity, our oropharynx behind the oral cavity, and then our laryngopharynx, which includes a part of our larynx. So this video here is covering the larynx and trachea. What you see here is the model when it is closed versus when it is open. So to focus in, what we see is our thyroid cartilage. It'll have this prominent feature called the laryngeal prominence. You've probably heard it be called the Adam's apple. And then this second thing of cartilage would be called the cricoid cartilage. And then every ring after that would be called the tracheal cartilage because it supports the trachea, which is from here down, and this includes our larynx. If we look at the open side, again we have that large thyroid cartilage, but now we can see the epiglottis. We can see the glottis, which includes the false and true vocal cords. We can see the cricoid cartilage both here and here. We can see the individual tracheal cartilages, and we can see the inside of the trachea. There is one cartilage that you need to know called the arytenoid cartilage. It is normally seen here, but for some reason is not included on this model. This video is to get a better idea of the lungs. So as you can see, here's that trachea and larynx model we just looked at. But then here is the rest of the trachea leading into the lungs themselves. So remember, these rings surrounding the trachea are called our tracheal cartilage. What you see here is the right side and the left side. The left has two lobes, and it only has two to accommodate the heart, versus the right side, which has three different lobes. So what you see is the right superior lobe, right middle lobe, and right inferior lobe. You can also see the fissures that separate them. So we have our right oblique fissure and our right horizontal fissure. On the left side, we have our left superior lobe and our left inferior lobe, and they're separated by the left oblique fissure. If I take these lungs out, you can get a better idea of what that looks like. And what it looks like. Here's that same model, but with the lungs taken off. So again, we can see the left superior lobe and the left inferior lobe and the left oblique fissure. And then we get our right superior lobe, right middle lobe, right inferior lobe, right oblique fissure, and right horizontal fissure. And you can also see the heart and how it is fitting into that cardiac notch seen on the left side. So this is a shot of our torso model. I've named him Jim for the purposes of this video, so say hi to Jim. We are going to be looking at Jim's respiratory tract. So starting up top, we can actually see those concha and meatuses again. We can see that external nair, the vestibule, nasal cavity, internal nairs, and then we start to get into that nasopharynx and oropharynx. If we come down, we can see our thyroid cartilage. We can see the thyroid gland. Then we can see the trachea and all the tracheal cartilage rings. Then we can actually start to see the beginnings of the bronchial tree. So this area of cartilage where it splits into the two trees is called the carina. And then we have our primary bronchus on both sides, and they will split into secondary bronchi. And then we have our right lung and our left lung. So we have our left superior lobe, our left inferior lobe, our left oblique fissure. Then we have our right superior lobe, right middle lobe, right inferior lobe, our right horizontal fissure, and our right oblique fissure. So everything we've covered so far can be seen on this purple respiratory model. So we're going to start with our upper respiratory tract. We have our external nairs and nasal vestibules. We have our nasal cavity. We have our superior, middle, and inferior concha, our superior, middle, and inferior meatus. We have our internal nairs. We have our auditory tube, the hard palate, the soft palate, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. We have our epiglottis, which covers the glottis seen right here. And then we have our trachea and our lungs. Over here we can get a better idea of the bronchial tree. So up here we have our thyroid cartilage, then our cricoid cartilage, and then all of these afterwards are called tracheal cartilage. This is our trachea. This cartilage where it splits is called the carina. And then the very first lobe that you see is called the primary bronchus. When it splits again, we then have a secondary bronchus. And then when those split further, we get our tertiary bronchus and eventually our terminal bronchioles and our respiratory bronchioles. And then if we look down here, we have a nice respiratory bronchiole going into some alveolar sacs. So the alveolar sac is the entire thing, and it's made up of individual alveoli. So all these little bubbles make up the alveolar sac. And as you can see, there are capillary beds because this is where we transport and exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. This is a model that includes several alveolar sacs. So starting from the top, what we see here is a terminal bronchiole, which then transitions to a respiratory bronchiole to actually enter alveolar sacs. An alveolar sac is a large structure made up of individual alveoli. So each of these is an alveolus, which is the singular version, and this whole thing is the alveolar sac. You can also see the pulmonary vein and the pulmonary artery. Remember, arteries are normally red and veins are normally blue, but the pulmonary artery and veins is one of two exceptions to this rule. And if I turn this around, you also get to see just how those capillary beds really intertwine with the alveolar sacs and the individual alveoli for proper gas exchange. So this model is an extremely up-close view of an alveolar sac. So it's like if we were to cut this alveolus in half, that is what we are seeing here. So if we turn this around, we get some other pretty colors. Again, we see two alveoli, this whole thing being an alveolar sac. And the idea here is that you can see that there are multiple cells at play There is some network structures which allows for gas exchange. We have a little bit of smooth muscle involved, some tiny bits of cartilage where needed. But the big things here is whole thing is an alveolar sac, and these are individual alveoli. So what you see here are cadaver lungs. So first we need to orient ourselves to the right and left side. This is the right side. It has 3 lobes. And then this is the left side, and it has 2 lobes. So remember, the left side only has 2 lobes because it's got to accommodate the heart and the cardiac notch that you would see right here. So let's start with the left side. This is our superior lobe. This is our inferior lobe. And this is the oblique fissure that separates them. I want to point out that this right here may look like a lobe, but it's actually a false lobe. It is not served by its own bronchial tree, and it's really just a flap, so do not consider it a lobe. This is the left side with only 2 lobes. On the right side, we have our superior lobe, our middle lobe, and our inferior lobe. We have our horizontal fissure, which separates our superior and middle, and then we have our oblique fissure, which separates our middle and inferior. Remember, always include right and left. That goes for both the lobes and the fissures.